Hello, everybody. I'm Philburt, President and CEO of AIM Employers Association, and welcome to This Week at Work.
Welcome to the only show about the workplace that offers you front row seats and a microphone, bringing you practical, timely, and accurate insights so that you can more effectively lead your organization. It's Thursday, January 19th, episode 214. Today, we talk about people analytics. It's a topic Tanya Zion introduced when appearing on episode 202 as a real area of opportunity when faced with a hybrid workforce and the evolving psyche of workers. As a senior HR consultant with her finger on the pulse of people management, we're happy to welcome her back. Plus, Tom Chibnall brings news about the EEOC's plan to target employers using AI to make employment decisions. Now, we want to hear from you, so speak up, take the poll, and ask your questions now. All this and more on This Week at Work.
All right. Thank you for joining us and welcome back. Because of you watching, listening, and interacting and sharing this show with your friends, you've helped us determine some of the topics that we have going forward, and we're very appreciative of that. Our objective is to help you run your business most effectively. And to do that, we need to know what you're interested in, and we will bring it to attention here on This Week at Work. With that said, we have Tanya Zion back by popular demand. Tanya, good morning and welcome back to This Week at Work. How are you today?
I'm good. And how are you?
Yes, we're doing great. And I'm happy to have you joining us on February 10th. Just next month at the factory for our summit, our Wayfinder Summit. It'll be our second Wayfinder Summit, and happy to have you back on main stage for that. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next month. Tanya is coming to us today from North Carolina, where she lives and works there. So welcome back, Tanya. And Chibs, happy to have you with us again this morning, filling in for Bert as he's off telling everyone that he's in trial. But do you have any evidence of that, Chib?
Phil, I actually went and saw it in person. So I had to see it to believe it. So I can tell you that Bert's probably wishing he was here with you rather than where he's at right now, but he'll do a great job.
He wasn't up there going, you can't handle the truth.
Not yet, at least. It was just the trial. So we'll see if that happens later.
Yeah. All right. That's good. I'm sure he does a great job. I would not want to be going against Bert on trial. He's a smart man, and don't tell him I said that. Hopefully he's not listening this morning, but I have a lot of respect for his experience and abilities, that's for sure. All right, so we got some interesting things to talk about today on the program, but let's introduce our poll first, because we're going to talk a lot about people analytics. There's a lot going on from a legal compliance standpoint, and everyone's talking about it, and you've requested it, so we're bringing it to you. Do you employ people analytics in your organization? That is our poll question. We have 5 result answers possibly for you to select from. No, there are no plans to do so. No, but we plan to do so. Yes, we have developed our own system. Yes, we've purchased people analytics software. If you've done that, tell us what you purchased. We want to share it with everyone. And yes, we use an outside vendor to help us. People analytics, big data, people problems, challenges, hiring challenges that continues inflation. We got lots of things that people analytics can help us decide and manage. But we're going to start with you, Chibs, and lawyer on the clock.
All right, it's time to look into what's trending in employment law. Lawyer, you're on the clock.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's timely that we're talking about this today. And I'll start here, but earlier this month, a couple of weeks ago, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, released its 2023 strategic strategy plan, where they kind of list what they're going to target over the year. For example, last couple of years, they had targeted things like disability discrimination. And what did we see? We saw a concerted effort by the commission to actually investigate those things a little bit, probably more thoroughly than they would have otherwise. Well, what do you know on this year's strategic enforcement plan? Analytics.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that they are specifically targeting is artificial intelligence programs that are designed to help in the recruitment, hiring, even the promotional process or any sort of personnel decisions you make. So on our radar already is this idea that the EEOC is going to be coming after these programs, or at least looking more deeply into them than they have been before. Some of the concerns that they have regarding these programs is, the inherent bias that might be embedded in the algorithm, or maybe the way it's administered to certain individuals, whether it's by age or by ability, whether it's really verifying the essential functions of the job that you're asking them to do. So what we're going to see, and what our listeners should be looking at, is what kind of programs do we have? What kind of algorithms are we using? Ask your vendor if you've got one. What the program looks like, how they come up with it. And I say that specifically is because the EEOC says, even if it's your vendor's fault that this is a discriminatory practice, it's your fault.
So you select the tools, you select your business process, and that's where potentially the risk is. So Chibs, when you're saying this, and we hear about artificial intelligence and EEOC, and we're trying to put that together, examples of what that might be. I'm thinking in my mind, for an example, if I use assessments tools for hiring, and I know there are organizations out there, even against our best advice, that really use the tool as the decision maker or final decision maker in the hiring process. Is that one example that maybe the EEOC is concerned with, that it might be targeting?
Yeah, that's right, Phil. In fact, I would ask, did you read that enforcement plan? Because that's specifically one of the things.
I just talk to lots of people every day, and I know what individuals are wanting to do. I completely understand the comfort and the logic of it, and I recognize some of the risk of it. I mean, it seems logical to me that someone can, say, look, we're looking for somebody who is very analytically driven in data management, versus someone who opposite of that in today's conversation is, really more of a firefighter and goes on gut feel, and wants to approach things based upon their experience, but not data. So we use a tool to help us determine your profile preferences, if you will, as a human being. And then we make a decision with that. And I think that's what the EEOC is concerned with when that creates a discriminatory problem.
Yeah, that's right. And, you talk about them in terms of these fit algorithms or fit practices. They'll call them cultural assessments or, fit assessments. These are buzzwords for the EEOC now. They're going to be looking for that. So if you have a practice, or if you're employing these practices and call them something like, this is our employment culture fit test, that's going to raise an alarm for the EEOC now. They're going to want to look into that and want to understand, what does that mean? How are you implementing it? For the very reasons that you were just talking about, Phil. For an example, for listeners here, imagine where you're using this software and part of that process is responding verbally to questions. That's not going to necessarily pick up on the quality of a candidate if that candidate might have a speech impediment. And that's going to be a problem for the EEOC, because they're going to say, you just screened an applicant based on a disability. And that's sort of a concrete example of what they're talking about. So you're absolutely right. You need to look at your programs. You might even want to look about how you're labeling those programs. If you're calling them fit tests or cultural assessments, you might want to think of a different way of approaching that, because this is now on the radar for the EEOC. And, if you've been through one of these investigations before, this is a little bit different than, say, an individual discrimination case. This is going to lend itself much better to the EEOC systemic investigation practice, which looks a lot different, and it's a lot more cumbersome and a lot more intensive. Instead of providing a few documents about an individual employment decision, the EEOC is going to want everything. They're going to want you to turn over your, the basics and the analytics behind the analytics, so to speak. So you're going to be looking at, instead of an individual claim, you're looking at the EEOC looking at you as a class claim. And that's a much different animal than dealing with a traditional EEOC discrimination claim. And I will say that the systemic investigative practice has really sort of burgeoned here in St. Louis, at least. There's newer people in that office, and the agenda has been to push systemic investigations where possible. So there's a concerted effort out there. Your listeners, our listeners need to know that because, well, this may be something that we thought was a wonderful tool, but it carries inherent risk in it that we need to be assessed and, need to be assessed throughout the process, not just stages.
Yeah. And I think, Tom, what I would always suggest, and I'd be interested in your comment as our time is coming to a close on this topic, two things. One is there's a topic you and I didn't get to yet today on this segment that I want to get to next week when you join us. And that is large group layoffs and using the right data and analytics to help us in that decision that are defensible, right? Let's talk about that next week on our program and lead with that on Lawyer on the Clock. Now, the other part of this is we're not saying don't use data in the hiring process. We're saying be careful how you use data, how you classify the use and purpose of the data, and let it be a part of the decision-making process, but not a difference maker in the, not the definitive, well, you didn't score at a particular level on this assessment, therefore you're not being hired. And we're talking about profile assessments more than we are competency assessments here, I think. But I would assume there's some concerns with competency assessments as well when we think about disabilities and whether that's things like attention deficit, it could be autism, things like that, that can affect how tests are taken, when, and so on. It doesn't necessarily determine real capability.
Yeah, that's right, Phil. And, you hit on something that I wanted to bring up is this idea that, the tests are not necessarily useless by any means. They're helpful, but be careful in the way you administrate it, and also understand that it shouldn't be the crutch that you're relying on. There's other things here. And as I would tell anybody who's going through these processes, remember that just doing it one way is not the only way. And, realize that if you do have this analytic process, that if it has a test involved, there might be an alternate way to use that test or to administer that test, which will be a safeguard against various other claims like a disability or any other discriminatory claims. Always remember that behind the test is a good function, but the way we administer it is oftentimes where we get in trouble.
Yep, absolutely. Chip, that's great information. Thank you again. I hope you stay with us here because you can help us conversation here with Tanya as well. I want to move on to Philburt's Forum. There are some funny things that producer Nick discovered when looking up this topic. Producer Nick, can we run Philburt's Forum?
You've just entered Philburt's Forum, where we peel the onion back and take a lighter look at the workplace.
All right, so there are some funny cartoons associated with this topic, and what scares me when I looked at them is how real they felt, because I think I have found myself on both ends of the spectrum of these cartoons. The first one is analytics in the workplace here. It would appear, Hopkins, that your gut feel was only indigestion. And I can tell you that my gut feel has given me indigestion plenty of times. But that is for sure something that, some people manage with their gut versus analytics. They're comfortable with it. And I would bring our attention to like Moneyball and baseball and using analytics and data. There was a time in baseball when it was like analytics was actually just considered a joke in baseball, that it was all about feel in the individual. And it really turns out to be that analytics with the experience of good management and scouting and so forth, that seems to be what works best. So that's a really good one there, producer Nick. I love that one. Let's go on to our next little cartoon here. Let's see here, another one on people analytics. You may well have data, Smithers, but I have strong opinions and I pay your wages. Yep, I've experienced that as well. Definitely where my boss didn't necessarily want to recognize the data. And a lot of times this presents itself for me when someone is like, we don't want to do employee opinion surveys or engagement surveys, because we don't plan to do anything about it. Now, that to me is just an absolutely crazy mindset to have, particularly in today's environment where retention and hiring is so difficult. And I would say, join me tomorrow morning on the WOW session when we're going to talk a lot about data, big analytics, retention and analytics and recruiting on our national survey that we have done across the United States. That's tomorrow morning at the WOW session. I think that might be at 8 or 8:30. You can find that on our website and register for that. And this will be our last one here this morning. This is analytics in the workplace. Again, when you two have finished arguing your opinions, I actually have data. And I think I've been all three of those people right there before, again, in my experience. But I often in arguing my opinion, and if someone is sitting quietly with a little smirk on their face and they're like, well, when you're done, I have some data, and actually you are both wrong. So it's quite funny. I think we can all relate to that. And let's call that Philburt's Forum. We look at the poll results that we have going so far, some great results. Leading the way is no, and there are no plans to do so. That doesn't really surprise me. I understand that because we're not and have not been conditioned in human resource over the last 20 years to use people analytics. But nevertheless, it is increasingly becoming more popular. It is almost becoming a necessity to do our job well. Large corporate America is using it in a very powerful way. And I think as it makes its way down to the more medium to small size businesses, we will be doing it too. I do think we use it more than we realize. It just may not be in the most formal way. And I want to get some of Tanya's opinion on that as well. So please keep responding here. There looks like there are some plans for about 20% of our audience today that's responded to plan to do so. We'd like to hear more about that in the chat. I'm seeing that is starting to fill up. And Tanya, welcome back again. I'm looking so forward to seeing you next month. It's always pleasant to have you with our staff and team and with our members who have come to love you so much. So thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Phil. What a warm welcome. I appreciate that. Hey, on this whole notion of whether or not you're going to implement it, Julie actually popped in on chat. And one of the things that she said is that they've added the analytic systems to their ADP HRIS system. And I think that might be a pretty good example for a lot of our listeners. And she said, it took a lot to set it up on the front side, but now we have data. And so I just want to kind of reiterate what we've been saying all along. We don't want anyone to walk away and say data is bad and you don't want to be utilizing these tools. What we're seeing is this really needs to be part of an overall process of decision making. And if you're making decisions fully on your gut, then you're missing an opportunity to really lean into the data. And if you're making decisions only on data, then that puts you at risk. And so what we want to do is have a comprehensive strategy as it relates to our people analytics so that we can optimize each and every one of those positions. So I think that's really what we want to drive home today as we're talking about that. And I know in my work that I'm doing with the employee engagement and opinion surveys, I see this all the time. I walk in and one of the very first things I say when I do those readbacks is, hey, I want to understand from your leadership team, kind of what's your feel? Is it what you thought it would be? And time again, people will give me their gut response. Well, we kind of knew it was going to be low in this area. And maybe the data even supports that. But what really happens and where we're really able to move things along is when we ask the question, why? And that's really what we want to get to and what we want to drive to.
That is just my favorite question. I hate to interrupt you, Tanya, but
No, that's
fine. I love asking that question, why? Because all too often we're not able to articulate the why from a good business logic standpoint. And it comes down to a feeling and experience, my intuition. And sometimes, unfortunately, we're not even sure why we're doing certain things other than that's what we've always done. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's one of the best questions an HR professional or business leader can ask is why?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we find is that when we ask that question, this comes up all the time on the survey. Employees want more communication. And then I'll talk to the leaders, and leaders will say, but we don't understand. We send emails, we send text messages, we send it through our managers. And yet people are still coming back and saying communication in our organization is lacking. And I'm like, well, why do we think they're saying that? If you're doing all of those things, what else is needed? Why do we need to do that? And that's where we utilize focus groups. And what we learn from employees is when they're talking about communication, they're really talking about how what they're doing in the organization relates back to the organization's purpose, strategic goals, how they make an impact. And it's really not the forum in the way we're communicating, but it's what we're communicating. And you can never get to that answer if you don't dig in and get curious.
Yeah. And I think that becomes really important for us to be able to answer that question of why in the data. Now, something here, I just want to tie a few pieces together because Julie is making a comment, and I think all of us, including our listeners, can relate to this. And particularly since we have such a heavy HR listening audience. So Julie, again, is explaining further. She has friends and family that are looking for position. We all have these people. They're like, hey, if it's so easy to get a job today because everyone is hiring, why do I keep getting kicked out? And Tom, I think this is what you're talking about with the concerns of the EEOC as well. And I'm an advocate of it. I'm not suggesting not to do it. I'm just suggesting to make sure we do it the right way. And that is where we have pre-qualifying questions during the application process. It helps us fast track candidates that might be more or less qualified into the right place. And, what happens is they're getting kicked out of the candidate pool by answering these questions. And I think that in part is also what the EEOC is concerned with AI.
Yeah, Phil, that's right. I mean, that's simply as you can put it, much like Julie's comment there, these folks are probably very well qualified for these positions, but they're being eliminated sort of no fault of their own. And the question that you went back to is why? Why is this happening? And that's what the EEOC wants to know. Why? Is there inherent bias? Is the algorithm flawed? Is it, set up in a way to exploit a certain bias that we have? And that's really the issue. The issue is not necessarily with the concept here, as Tanya put it. This is something that, we're not discouraging people from doing. We just want to make sure that it's being done in the appropriate and right way. And from my perspective, I want to make sure you're doing it in a way that's not going to cause you pain on the backside. You don't want somebody who's qualified for a job not to get the job because of an issue, and then I'll realize now I have a failure to hire discrimination lawsuit that I'm having to defend. As somebody else in the comment, I think it was Dave posted, we have a lot of data, but no information. And that's the connection that we need to make. How do we make that data into information that informs our decisions?
Yeah. And I think Tanya does that quite a bit with our members and how she interacts with them. And, one way that I see that, and I just saw Dave yesterday. So good morning again, Dave. One of the things that happens is, we will run employee opinion and engagement surveys that gives us data. And then what happens is we get right where Dave is at. We're like, but that's not enough information or not good enough information to do things. And that's, so this is where, Tanya analyzes the results. She understands the intent of the question. She understands the dynamic of different work environments. And then she's able, often, many times, the best thing to do is use that data to get deeper information, whether it's through focus groups or additional ways to gain insight into what do we mean when we say yes or no. Because sometimes it starts with yes or no, or, a score of 1 to 4 or 5. And, so what does that mean? What are examples that you're referring to? And it really takes an interactive process often to get to that valuable information piece. Tanya, can you explain that a little bit more for us or expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just a normal thing that when you get those surveys back, everybody goes down and looks for the red, right? Like, where are we in trouble? What do we need to improve on? And that's a great first glance at that. But really what we're looking at is we're looking at the interplay between the dimensions. So when we do those surveys, we're looking at 10 different dimensions, and they range from executive leadership effectiveness to pay, right? And everything in between. And so what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the interplay in those answers in between those different categories. And where we find the most effective surveys is when we're also looking at that from a demographic data standpoint. And so we can do that in terms of tenure, we can do it in role in the organization. And what that tells me is there a group of employees that their experience is unique as compared to another set of similarly situated employees? And, I had one survey that came across communication scores were high across the board except for one group. And we looked at that group and it happened to be the IT group. And they ranked communication just bottom of the barrel. It was really low. And I got really curious about that because that was a standout on the data. Well, when we really dug into all of the information, the reason that IT had answered that way is they had also answered low in terms of having kind of enough forewarning of when changes happened in the organization that they could respond. Your IT department needs to order materials. They need to get everything set up and ready for the end user, and they weren't getting that information ahead of time. And so their experience in the workplace differed from everyone else who said you're communicating just fine. That's what data can really do for us. But we have to ask, Phil, I love the question why. And a close second is, so what? Once we learn this, now what are we going to go and do about it?
Well, I'm going to use that one later today. So what? I challenge everyone to ask why and then so what, right? And not so what as in like, oh, so what, right? It's really like, so what? Like, so what happens next? Or if we don't, or if we do. So yeah, I like that. Hey, producer Nick, let's look at those poll results one more time. As I'm watching those develop, I want to get to making a point here with Tanya. So it looks like our second leading category has changed its shape, and it's the answer is yes, a combination of above. So as we're starting to see more people using or planning to use people analytics, Tanya, maybe we can just talk about a few examples of what people analytics is, because it feels and sounds scary to some who aren't using sophisticated systems, but are probably still doing people analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking around one tool that I think is a very useful tool. It's very easy to engage with, but people analytics can also be anything else that you're tracking as it relates to HR. And then it also can be, how are we getting the things done within our organization? And how are people doing that? Phil, you've heard me say this. I talk about this all the time. I operate in a framework that's people, process, and communication. And so those three things have to come together well. And where I think when we start to talk about people analytics, it's really those intersections of how that's happening. I was in doing a leadership development course yesterday, and the group said that I'm just so confused because we're getting this feedback and I don't understand this feedback. How do we get people to actually read our communications when we send out emails? Because what we're finding is that only 20% of them are opening it. Well, in some ways that's people analytics, because we're saying, are our employees engaging with what we're sending out? And so we had kind of brainstormed around that and, be able to put that in your learning management system and be able to see what your interaction looks like. So people analytics can be something like what Julie was referencing, where you have this hiring tool where you're asking these questions up front, but it can be all the way through in what you're looking at in terms of you're doing pay surveys and how that relates and what bands you're looking at. So we're really talking about analytics that touch your people that ultimately are going to drive how they engage with your organization.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
And I always encourage people, most of us are doing, I think it would change our results if we say, are we measuring turnover? Are we measuring time to hire? Are we doing employee opinion and engagement surveys? That's a people analytics. If we're doing it frequently enough, but not too frequently, that allows us to trend and measure data and then take action. That's the intent of what we're doing. If we do affirmative action plans and we're using that data to help us identify, gaps in our diversity hires and how we want to manage our staffing initiatives. These are all simple examples that many of us have been doing for a long time of people analytics. What happens most frequently is I find that there's not a process. So when you're talking about your process, there's not a formal environment in which we review the analytics of our people. Let's say they come from HR or they're gathered by someone in finance, even, to where we look at their business results related to our people in a formal forum. For an example, you probably have engineering reviews with management, or you have quality reviews with management, or you have financial reviews with management? Do we have people analytics reviews with management the very same way we do all of our other important business processes? And that answer is traditionally not so much, but we do have lots of good data. We just don't have a forum where it's being taken serious. And I think that goes back to some of the Philburt's forum, where it's like, well, you can have all you want, but I pay the bills and my gut experience tells me differently. So that is something, Tanya, you look like you want to add one more comment as we're coming up to a close here.
Yeah, I think that's it. And it's not only having that where everyone's around the table, it's also having the debrief and how we communicate that out, right? And having this process and plan and having a clear communication strategy so that people know what it is, so that there's no confusion and there's clarity throughout the organization.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we talked about last week when we were looking at, Top Gun processes with our fighter pilot who will be at our conference this year. Tanya will also be a speaker at our conference this year, where we're able to have, a debrief to help us not make the same mistakes again and ensure we get better and better each time. That wraps up this week's program. Thank you for joining us, Chibs. We appreciate it. Tanya, as always, it's a pleasure. And we will be back here next Thursday when Tom is going to tell us more about the large group layoffs. And if you're considering any type of cutbacks or anything like that, you're going to want to listen to some of these process controls that we want to use analytics for to help us avoid risk and mitigation. So thank you both very much. Producer Nick, thank you. And we'll see you back here next Thursday, 7:30 Central Time.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues. Forward our invites. Share the link, aimea.org/thisweekatwork, or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment, like LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere you are. And you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.